Well, you've been on this trek with me for the last 10 years. I found myself 10 years ago at the age of 45 not feeling a whole lot emotionally. Started working on that, and as I've worked on things and shared in different sermons while Ross has been gone here and there, you found me to be decently emotional, and it's just driven some of you crazy. I know that. It's driven my wife crazy at times. Last night on the way home, Troy was with me, and I asked him about it. He said, "Dad, why do you got to be so emotional? Oh my gosh." It just drove him crazy. Today, if I get emotional, what's that? No. If I get emotional, three things. Hey, no, wait, let me finish my sentence. I got notes. My gosh, must be this daylight saving time thing. I don't know. You guys didn't get enough sleep or something. No. Number one, do not feel sad for me. Do not feel sad for me if I get emotional. I hear feeling things is a good thing. I hear feeling things passionately is a good thing. Do not, please, don't feel sad for me. And don't try to fix me. Doesn't mean something's wrong if I get emotional. Number two, don't let it distract you from the sermon. Now, I find myself, when someone gets emotional, I start, oh my gosh, what do I need to, please don't do that. Just try to keep focused on what I'm trying to get across. Whether you agree or disagree, that's another point. But please don't let emotions, if they come, distract you. Lastly, and this is just sort of you see the human side of me. If I get emotional today, don't think I'm weak. Okay? That's just something for me. I don't know, maybe it's sinful to think that, but please don't think I'm weak. But again, Ross has got a family gathering this weekend. I believe they have a bunch of birthdays in March, some on the same day. Ross's birthday was Tuesday, my son told me. Facebook. I just don't do Facebook. But everybody knows everything about everybody but me. So last Tuesday was Ross's birthday, and so he asked if I wanted to preach. I said, yes, please. And so what I try to do is I try to honor the series that he's involved in. 2 weeks ago, he preached on the feeding of the 5,000. And that's in John chapter 6, the beginning. At the end of John chapter 6, he preached on last week, Jesus is the bread of life. And the idea last week was the goal of that whole idea, and he said it himself, is to take it into the deepest part of who you are. If you want to have the life that I can bring you, you can't just touch the bread. You can't just taste the bread. You need to consume the bread into the deepest part of who you are. Okay? And so I went back to John chapter 6 and just started reading to see if there's something in there that I could preach on, that just to honor his series of preaching through the Gospel of John. And I found a little tiny portion of scripture between those two stories that he sort of bleeped over. And so I called him. I said, did you not want this preached on, or what do you think? He says, no, do whatever you want. That's fine. I just didn't see anything that I wanted to preach on, which is fine. And so I want to read that for you right now. It's John chapter 6, verses 16 to 21. That evening, his disciples went down to the shore to wait for him. But as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come, they got into the boat and headed out across the lake toward Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them as they rowed, and the sea grew very rough. They were 3 or 4 miles out when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat, and they were terrified. But he called out to them, I am here, don't be afraid. Then they were eager to let him in, and immediately the boat arrived at their destiny. When I first read that, the word terrified jumped out and sat in my lap. I'll explain why in a minute, but I wanted to know a little bit more. Lord, is this what you want me to learn about? Is this what you want me to preach on? So I jumped over to the Gospel of Mark. In Mark chapter 6, tells the same story, a little bit more details. And so I want to read some of that to you from Mark chapter 6, verses 47 to 50. It says, during the night, the disciples were in their boat out in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, he came to them walking on the water, and he started to go past them. But when they saw him walking on the water, they screamed in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him, but Jesus spoke to them at once. It's all right, he said. I'm here. Don't be afraid. And then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped, and they were astonished at what they saw. And again, that word terrified, that word terror, just leapt at me. And here's why. Here's why. One of my quirks, one of my many quirks, let me add that accurately, is that when people ask me, how you doing, I think they really want to know. And so when almost everyone asks me, I'll stop and I'll pause and I'll start to think about it. At that point, they start to panic because they think something must be horrible if you don't just say fine, right? That's what everybody says is fine. I calm them down, continue to think, and tell them how I really feel. And sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's average. In fact, average really messes with their head. I feel average. They don't know what to do with that. For the last 2 months, when people have asked me, I've had a greater dilemma than normal. And what I find myself telling people after I stop and think it through is I tell them it's kind of like when Sue and I had our first child, Carly. My world is upside down. My world is scary. My world, everything is changing. And I'm not sure I can handle it. But it's the best thing in the world. And so that's what I tell them. You see, for the last couple of months, about 2 months ago now, I realized a deep, deep vein of sin that I hadn't realized before. I realized a couple of months ago that from a very early age, as a little boy, and it cemented itself through my teenage years, that I learned to be a taker. I learned to look out primarily for what I wanted and for what I needed, and I would do whatever it took to go get it. And even in my marriage, that's been true. I didn't mean to. I didn't see it. I was doing the right things all the way along, it seemed like, for the most part. But most of what I did was manipulation. I saw for the very first time 2 months ago. Most of what I saw was selfishness. It was for what I was going to get in return. Most of it was for the accolade of being a good guy. Most of it was for me. And 2 months ago, I saw this for the very first time, very, very clearly. And a few months ago, I realized what my sin, this wasn't dysfunction at this point, it was just sin, had cost my family, especially my wife. I concluded 2 months ago that not one day in our entire marriage had she felt celebrated for who she was. I was too busy trying to get what I wanted or to change her into what I wanted her to be. And it hurt to contemplate the pain I'd caused her these last 23 years. So I made a decision 2 months ago, at the age of 55, to start doing something I'd never really done fully. To do the opposite of what I'd been doing since I was a kid. 2 months ago, I made a decision to intentionally be selfless and to serve my family, especially my wife. It's to serve her. I made a decision 2 months ago to think of others first and not just for the sake of loving, just for the sake of loving, not for gauging what I would get in return. I made a decision to quit manipulating at that very subtle level that I had gotten so good at. And to be even more clear, 2 months ago, I decided I needed to start being a vulnerable and gentle man. I can't tell you the details of how I came to this situation. It's too personal. But that's what I concluded. I'm not beating myself up. I just saw my sin for the first time. And I'm trying to change the way I've done things for so many years. And I have to be very, very honest this morning. It terrifies me. It scares me like crazy. And now you see my interest. He says, don't be afraid. My question is this: is it okay to be terrified? Is it okay to be terrified? Now, if you're going to find out what the Bible has to say on something, there's two ways you can do it. You can take the specific portion of Scripture and you can dive into the Greek, you can dive into the Hebrew, whatever it's being used, and you can look at the context, you can look at the history, and you can just go deep, deep, deep into that specific portion of Scripture. And you might be saying to yourself, Roger, you've never done that. You don't know the Greek, Roger. Good. There's another way to look at it, and I'm so glad. What you can do is you can step back from the specific portion of Scripture, and you can look at the Bible as a whole and say, what does the Bible say about this? What does the Bible say about being terrified of something? And so I used the poor man's or the amateur's version of Logos. I went to BibleGateway.com. Feel free to use that if you want. It's really simple. And I looked up the word afraid. I looked up the word afraid. I didn't like what I found. Because all through the Gospels, Jesus says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I said, but I'm afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I looked at the sentence. I looked at the verses. They all just said, don't be afraid. I didn't like that answer. So I looked somewhere else. My mind thought of that Old Testament story that I grew up with, and they had become my heroes, and maybe yours, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I remember that story in Daniel, and even as I turned to Daniel, I go, I'm not going to like the end of this story. I'm not going to like what I find. But I did show some courage. I went and found out what Daniel 3 said about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and that fiery furnace. And if you know the story, it goes like this, of course. I think I'll get it right. King Nebuchadnezzar makes a golden statue, and some people are trying to trick Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they get the king to make the statue, and they say when the trumpet sounds, everyone should bow down. King says, that's a great idea. The trumpet blows, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will not bow down. The guys trying to trick him said, aha, king, they're not bowing down. They need to die. The king said, bring them to me. The three come before the king, and the king says, the trumpet's going to blow again, and when it blows, you better die. And my heroes said this. They replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, your majesty can be sure that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Now there is hitting it on the head. That is what it's supposed to look like. They were what, 20, 30 yards away from the furnace probably. They knew it was there. They could probably feel the heat. And they said, if you don't bow down, you're going to go die. Not a quick guillotine type of death, but a grueling, painful, burning to death in the furnace type of death. And what did they say? They didn't even flinch, at least in the words that are written down. They didn't even flinch. I don't like that answer. So I looked someplace else. My mind thought of Joshua chapter 1, right? Joshua's getting ready to go into the promised land to take over, and God himself speaks to him and says this, get your nose in the word and be strong and courageous. Over and over again he says it. And I didn't really like that answer either, but I thought, you know what? I bet you if I go look up the definition of courage, it'll talk about being afraid and then doing the right thing, right? Here's what Daniel Webster has to say. By the way, I don't like Daniel Webster anymore. He said this is what courage means. The quality of mind or spirit that enables a person to face difficulty, danger, pain, etc., without fear. I don't like that answer. I don't like that answer, so you can guess what I did. Kept looking. I went to the book of Proverbs. Solomon, he understands people, the wisest guy in the world. Somewhere in there, he's going to be able to talk about what we should do when we are terrified. And I'm hoping for a nugget of indicator it's okay to be terrified. Didn't find a thing. I didn't look super long. It might be there, but I didn't find it. So you know what I did? I kept looking. I thought to myself, what would Jesus do? WWJD. What would Jesus do? So I thought through the Gospels, and a little light bulb came on. I seem to remember a time where Jesus seemed at least distraught. My mind went to the Garden of Gethsemane. And I sort of knew it was there, so I got kind of hopeful. Because I knew that Hebrews chapter 1 said that Jesus is the exact representation of God. So if Jesus does something, God says it's okay, or even closer, God probably does the same thing. I don't know. But it's okay. In other words, if Jesus did it, it's not a sin. It's okay to do what Jesus does. And so I turned to Matthew chapter 26, and I want to read some of that for you. And I just want to tell you, going into it, I like the answer. Matthew chapter 26, verses 37 to 44. I'm just going to read a couple of them. He took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John, and began to be filled with anguish and deep distress. A couple of days before the cross, right? Or a day or whatever it ended up being. He knew the cross was coming. He knew that it was going to be a horrible, horrible time period. And what did he do? He began to be filled with anguish and deep distress. And he told them, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. And he went on a little further and fell face down on the ground, praying, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me, yet I want your will, not mine. And then he went on, of course. He didn't want to do it. I like that answer. I like that answer. He began to be filled with anguish and deep distress, and his soul was crushed with grief. I can live with that. I can live with that. It's okay to be terrified. And you know why it's a good thing? Because loving well is terrifying. Especially if you understand it. And love is obviously has got a wide definition. But in that definition, you cannot get away from the fact that love means being vulnerable and being gentle. And I just had never truly done that before. Now, if you find yourself struggling to relate to me, well, I'm not really terrified of a whole lot, Raj. My wife and I were doing fine. There's just not a lot of scary stuff in there. Obviously, you're in your own little struggle. And if that's the case, God bless you. Please come and teach a class. But I want to remind you that according to 1 Peter, we are all to be moving forward. We are to be possessing certain qualities listed there in 1 Peter in ever-increasing amounts. So if today you're a great lover of people, and you're very vulnerable and you're very gentle, then tomorrow you're supposed to be more vulnerable and more gentle. We're all to be going forward. And that might bring some fear. Now here's the really good news. When you do it right, you don't have to look like me. You don't have to look like me. You being vulnerable and gentle does not need to look like me being vulnerable and gentle. But the problem is we all need to be more and more and more vulnerable and gentle in our love for people, especially those closest to us. Now, you still might be struggling to find yourself in this. Let me do the opposite, and let me share with you 3 things that I find myself doing instead of being vulnerable and gentle. And maybe you might be able to go, oh, maybe that's a little bit of me. Maybe. I know it's me. 3 things. First of all, a pattern of anger. a pattern of intensity and anger where you become defensive instead of being vulnerable and gentle. Maybe that's you. Maybe you have a pattern of fear where you simply withdraw from saying and being vulnerable and gentle. Maybe you're just afraid in certain situations. When you feel attacked by your spouse, perhaps, maybe you find that very scary, and so you just withdraw rather than saying the vulnerable, gentle thing that hurts. Or maybe you attack and get that anger issue. I don't know. And I'm pretty good at this one too, a pattern of apathy. It just looks like a veneer. I'm fine. Come on, Raj, get over it. I'm fine. I'm doing good. I'm good. But really, I'm good. Things are great. And this is not just a message for adults. This is not just a message for married people. Kids, teenagers, learn to be vulnerable and speak honest words of how you feel, even if it's difficult. It's the best time to learn it. So when you're young. This last Thursday night, our youth group went to, the Resistance Senior Youth Group went to Expressions, which is on the east side of town over here. And thank you for having such a great place, by the way. Actually, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm pretty sure it's you, Cindy. Is that right? Okay, good. Excellent. Well, we went over there Thursday night, and the group is supposed to get there at 6:30, right? And I tend to get there at 5:30, and I tend to take my guitar. And at 6:30, we get on the piano, and everyone gets wheeled in, and they sit down, and we just sing old hymns. And Cindy taught us the whole idea is just to help them have moments of joy as they remember their past and things comes to their mind. You know, Alzheimer's is just a nasty situation, and so you're just trying to help them have these moments. And songs oftentimes can do that. And so what I do at 5:30, an hour earlier, I go over during their dinner time and I start to sit down and play hymns around the dinner table just so they'll know what's coming and hopefully stay awake and be there at 6:30 for our gathering. Okay? So I get there at 5:30 and I get my guitar and I sit down at the table and I start to sing and I had this wonderful little moment where I'm next to this lady, these two ladies, and they're eating and I'm in the middle of an old hymn and all of a sudden the one on my right starts to sing alto. Oh. You just knew she sang in a choir and sang alto and loved alto. And she was good. She was really good. It wasn't sort of an alto. It was an alto. It was great. But I was worried because she's eating and singing at the same time. That's not a good combination. So I went into the other dining room, and I sat down with a couple of people, and I started to play and sing. And they weren't really too into what I was doing. And then a lady behind my back, said, "Do you know Just As I Am?" I said, "Oh, do I?" So I turned around to see this elderly gentleman, big bulk of a guy in his wheelchair, sort of hunched over. He can't really keep his head up. It looks like I don't know how that works. And then I think his wife was there feeding him. And I got to tell you, I love old people. I'm not as good as Cindy. And it still is a lot of work for me to go and be with them. But I love them. I love what they've been through. I love the simple fact that they got through life. And I don't know why. I just love to be there, especially and just sing hymns for them. It's just it just makes me feel so good to honor them with their music. And acoustics are great. Right, tile floor, and it's great. A little bit of reverb and echo. I just love it. Andy, you would love it. Okay, and so I'm in the middle of Just As I Am, and I'm struggling. I'm starting to get emotional because I just want to give this moment and this song to this couple. And I start to sing and I start to struggle, and all of a sudden he looks at me and he lifts his head up a little bit and he starts to mouth the words. I start to lose it. And then his wife, noticing him just sort of notice, she smiles. And it just means the world to me. And it just touches my heart. And somehow we get through the song, and here's something I didn't tell the other services. I swear a choir started to sing behind me. I swear. And I turned around, and it was 3 other people from youth group showed up and started singing. That was so funny. Oh, it was hilarious. Oh. But anyways, I saw that couple, and I said to myself, part of why I was crying is because I just want to love like that. I want to love Sue like that. And here's the thing. I want to love her like that now. I don't want to wait till we're in a home. I don't want to wait till she is incapable of feeding herself. I want to love her like that now. I want to be that vulnerable and gentle and strong and courageous with her now. Because that's what I vowed on my wedding day. And she deserves it. She deserves it. The disciples in the boat that night had it easy. All they had to do was stop being afraid. You and I, we got to stop being afraid and then go do something courageous. That's harder. Our task is not just to not be afraid. Our task is to move forward in ever-increasing quantities of being vulnerable and gentle and loving. Still terrified. That's what I want.